The snow fell so thick that Lowell Osborne could barely see his own hand stretched before his face, but he pressed forward anyway, tracking the fading indentations in the powder that marked where the orc woman had fled. He had been hunting elk in these mountains for 3 weeks when he stumbled across her makeshift camp 2 days prior, wounded and delirious from fever, and though she had snarled at him with what strength remained in her failing body, he had left her blankets and dried meat before retreating to a respectful distance. This morning, when he returned to check on her, she was gone, and the trail she left behind told a story of desperation rather than recovery. The wind howled through the pines, carrying ice that stung his weathered face like tiny knives. Lowell pulled his fur collar tighter around his neck and studied the tracks once more. They were uneven, staggering, the gait of someone who should not be walking at all, let alone fleeing into a blizzard. He knew these mountains better than most men knew their own homesteads, had lived in a cabin on the western slope for 5 years since leaving the lowlands and the war behind, and he understood that this storm would kill her if he did not find her soon. The tracks led higher up the mountain, away from the shelter of the valley. It made no sense unless she was running from something, or towards something she valued more than her own survival. Lowell checked his pack, confirming he still carried rope, flint, and the emergency shelter he always kept ready. He had provisions for another week if he rationed carefully, and more importantly, he had the knowledge to survive in conditions that would kill a lowlander within hours. But even for him, this was testing the limits. The snow had already filled in the older portions of her trail, leaving only the freshest impressions visible. Another hour and there would be nothing to follow at all. Lowell quickened his pace, his breath coming in controlled bursts of white vapor. His legs burned from pushing through drifts that reached past his knees in places, but he had endured worse. During the border wars, he had marched for 3 days without sleep, had carried wounded comrades through terrain that would have broken lesser men. This was different, though. This was a choice made freely, not an order from a commander he no longer respected. The orc woman had looked at him with such fierce suspicion when he first approached her makeshift shelter beneath the overhanging rock. Her skin was a deep sage green that reminded him of spring moss, and despite the fever burning through her, she had managed to bare her small tusks in warning. The wound in her side had been poorly bandaged, wrapped with strips of cloth that might once have been part of a tunic. He had seen enough battle injuries to recognize the work of a blade, not claws or teeth. Someone had attacked her with intent to kill. He had not asked questions then. Instead, he had simply set down his offerings and backed away, hands visible and empty of weapons. She had watched him retreat with eyes the color of amber, bright and feral in the shadows. When he returned that evening with more supplies, she had not eaten what he brought, but the blankets were gone from where he left them, and he took that as a small victory. Now she was running again, and he could not fathom why. The terrain grew more treacherous as he climbed. Rocky outcroppings jutted from the snow like broken teeth, and the wind gathered strength in the exposed areas, threatening to knock him from his feet. Lowell moved from tree to tree, using the ancient pines as anchors against the storm. The tracks were growing fainter. He pushed harder, ignoring the protest in his muscles. Then the tracks simply stopped. Lowell stood at the edge of a massive drift, easily 8 feet deep where the wind had piled snow against a natural formation of boulders. The last clear footprint pointed directly toward it, and then there was nothing but undisturbed white powder stretching in all directions. He circled the area, searching for any sign that she had changed direction, but found nothing. Either she had backtracked perfectly in her own prints, which seemed impossible given her weakened state, or she had gone into the drift itself. He studied the wall of snow more carefully. There, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, was a slight depression in the surface. Not a natural formation. Something had disturbed the snow and then it had partially refilled. Lowell drove his walking staff into the drift experimentally and felt it punch through into empty space beyond. A cave, or at least a hollow. She had gone to ground. He began digging with his hands, working carefully to avoid causing a collapse. The snow was lighter than he expected in some places, heavier in others, and within minutes his fingers ached from the cold despite his gloves. But he kept working, because turning back was not something he could make himself do. Not when he knew she was here, probably dying, definitely alone. His hand broke through into darkness. Cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of stone and earth. Lowell widened the opening, then called out, "I am not here to hurt you. I am the one who left you supplies." Silence answered him, but he thought he detected movement in the shadows beyond. "The storm is getting worse. If you stay here, you will freeze. Let me help you." Still nothing. Lowell sat back on his heels, considering his options. He could force his way in, but that would only terrify her more and might cause her to flee deeper into whatever cave system lay beyond. He could wait outside, but the storm would kill him long before stubbornness killed her if she had found adequate shelter. Or he could trust that somewhere beneath the fear and pain, she understood he meant no harm. He chose the third option, as foolish as it seemed. "My name is Lowell Osborne. I live alone in a cabin about 6 miles southwest of here. I came to these mountains 5 years ago to escape people, and I have not regretted that choice once." He spoke clearly, projecting his voice into the opening. "You are the first person I have tried to help in all that time. I understand if you do not trust me. Your people and mine have done terrible things to each other, but I swear on whatever honor I have left that I want only to see you survive this storm." The wind screamed around him, and snow pelted his back. His knees were already numb from kneeling in the drift. Still he waited, giving her time to decide. A voice emerged from the darkness, rough and strained. "Why?" It was the first word she had spoken to him. Lowell felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "Because leaving you to die would make me a coward and a liar," he said honestly. "I told myself when I came to these mountains that I would live according to my own conscience, not the rules other men tried to force on me. My conscience says you deserve help." "Your conscience is foolish," he almost smiled. "That has been said before." Another pause. Then, "I cannot walk." Lowell understood immediately. She had used the last of her strength to reach this shelter, and now her body had given out completely. Moving her would be difficult, but leaving her was impossible. "I am going to come in," he said. "I have rope and materials for a fire. Will you let me approach?" "Do what you will." The resignation in her voice told him she lacked the strength to fight him regardless of his intentions. He widened the opening until he could squeeze through, then dropped into the space beyond. It was not a large cave, barely 10 feet across and not quite tall enough for him to stand upright, but it was sheltered from the wind and the worst of the cold. His eyes adjusted slowly, and he found her in the far corner, slumped against the stone wall with one hand pressed to her wounded side. Up close, even in the dim light filtering through the entrance, she was striking. Her features held a fierce beauty that had nothing to do with human standards and everything to do with the strength evident in the set of her jaw, and the defiance still burning in her amber eyes. Her dark hair was matted with melted snow, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that concerned him. Lowell moved slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I am going to build a small fire. The smoke will vent through the entrance we came through. Then I will look at your wound if you allow it." "Why would you waste your supplies on me?" Because I have supplies to waste. He unpacked his flint and striker, gathering a small pile of tinder from the dry materials he carried. Within minutes, he had coaxed a flame to life, feeding it carefully with small sticks until it grew strong enough to provide meaningful warmth. The cave transformed from a tomb to a refuge as the firelight pushed back the shadows. She watched him work with those unwavering amber eyes. Now that he could see her more clearly, he noted details that told stories of their own. Her clothes were travel-worn but well-made, the kind of garments someone wore when they expected to be on the road for weeks or months. She wore leather bracers on both forearms, decorated with tribal patterns he did not recognize. A small knife hung at her belt, but she made no move to draw it. "I am going to come closer now," Lowell said. "I need to see how bad the wound is. It will kill me soon enough." Despite the words, she did not protest when he moved to her side. He examined the injury with practiced efficiency born of years tending wounded soldiers. The blade had entered below her ribs on the left side, a puncture wound that could have struck vital organs if it had been an inch deeper or higher. The flesh around it was inflamed, hot to the touch even through her shirt, and the bandages she had applied were soaked through with blood and other fluids. "This needs to be cleaned and properly dressed," he said. "It will hurt. Everything hurts already." Lowell retrieved his medical supplies, grateful that he had restocked before heading into the mountains. He had clean cloth, needle and thread, and a small bottle of strong alcohol that served both as disinfectant and, when necessary, pain management. He offered her the bottle first. "Drink. It will help." She took it with shaking hands and swallowed without hesitation, barely reacting to what had to be a burning sensation. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed briefly, and he noticed how cold her skin felt. The process of cleaning and stitching the wound was grim work. She made no sound beyond occasional sharp intakes of breath, even when he knew the pain had to be extraordinary. Lowell worked as quickly as his skill allowed, removing the soiled bandages, cleansing the wound with alcohol, and closing the worst of it with careful stitches. By the time he tied off the final thread and applied a clean dressing, sweat beaded on both their brows despite the cold. "You will need rest and food," he said, sitting back. "The fever will get worse before it gets better, but if we can keep the wound clean, you have a chance." "We," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "There is no we, human. You have done your duty. Leave me here and go." "The storm will last at least 2 more days," Lowell said, settling himself on the opposite side of the small fire. "Even if I wanted to abandon you, which I do not, I would be a fool to venture out now. We are stuck with each other for a while." She closed her eyes, whether in frustration or exhaustion he could not tell. "You do not know what you are doing. I know exactly what I am doing. I am keeping us both alive. My people will not see it that way, nor will yours." Lowell fed another stick to the fire. "Your people are not here, and I left mine behind years ago. Their opinions do not concern me." She opened her eyes again, studying him with an intensity that felt like being weighed and measured. "You are strange for a human." "I have been told that as well." Despite everything, the corner of her mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Then the fever claimed her again, and she slumped sideways. Lowell moved quickly, catching her before she could strike her head on the stone floor. He arranged her more comfortably, covering her with both his spare blanket and the one he had given her before, and settled in to wait out the storm. The wind howled outside their shelter like a living thing denied its prey. Lowell kept the fire burning low and steady, rationing his fuel carefully. He had enough to last 3 days if he was careful, maybe 4. After that, they would need to venture out regardless of conditions, because they would freeze without heat. He ate sparingly from his supplies and made sure water was available for when she woke. The hours crawled past, marked only by the slow movement of shadows on the cave walls and the endless moan of the blizzard beyond. Occasionally she stirred, muttering words in a language he did not understand, and he would check her fever and adjust her coverings. Night fell, though it made little difference in the darkness of the cave. Lowell dozed fitfully, trained by years of military service to wake at the slightest change. Each time he checked on her, she seemed a little worse. The fever climbed higher and her skin grew clammy. He began to wonder if his efforts had been in vain. Near what he estimated was midnight, she woke with a gasp, eyes wild and unseeing. "They are coming," she said, thrashing weakly. "Have to run. Have to hide." Lowell moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You are safe. We are in the cave. No one is coming. They cannot find me, cannot let them find me." "Who?" he asked, though he did not expect a coherent answer. "The clan. My clan. They will kill me for what I have done." Her eyes focused on him suddenly, lucid for a brief moment. "I saved a human child," she whispered. "From the raid. I hid her and told them she escaped. They found out. This wound is their justice." Then the fever took her again, and she fell back into delirium. Lowell sat frozen, processing what she had revealed. The border raids had been constant in the months before he left civilization. Orc clans sweeping down from the mountains to strike at outlying farms and settlements. He had fought in several defensive actions, had seen the aftermath of attacks. They were brutal affairs that left scars on both sides. And she had saved a human child at the cost of everything. He looked at her with new eyes, this orc woman who had chosen mercy over loyalty to her own people. She had been stabbed and cast out for that choice, left to die alone in the wilderness. Yet when he offered help, her first instinct had been to refuse, to protect him from the consequences of association with her. Lowell made a decision in that moment, one that felt both reckless and absolutely right. He would not merely keep her alive through this storm. He would take her to his cabin, give her time to heal properly, and help her decide what came next. If her own people had cast her out and humans would never accept her, perhaps she needed what he had found in these mountains, a place to simply exist without judgment. The storm raged for 2 full days and nights. Lowell kept the fire alive through careful rationing and melting snow for water. He forced her to drink whenever she surfaced from the fever dreams, and he kept her wound as clean as possible in the primitive conditions. His own supplies dwindled to almost nothing, but he gave her the larger portions whenever she could eat, knowing she needed the strength more than he did. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally died. Lowell dug his way out of the cave to find a world transformed by snow. The drifts stood as tall as his chest in places, and every tree bent under the weight of white. But the sky was clearing, showing patches of blue between the thinning clouds, and the temperature had risen enough that he could feel his face again. He returned to find her awake and watching the entrance. "The storm has passed," he said. "Can you walk?" She tried to push herself upright and failed. "No." "Then I will carry you." Her eyes widened. "That is madness. I am not some delicate human woman. I will be too heavy." Lowell almost laughed. "I have carried full-grown men in armor through mud and blood. I think I can manage." It took time to prepare. He fashioned a crude harness from rope that would allow him to carry her on his back without putting pressure on her wound. She protested every step of the process, but he ignored her objections with patient determination. Finally, when everything was ready, he crouched before her. "Put your arms around my shoulders. Try to hold on, but if you cannot, the rope will keep you secure." She hesitated, pride warring with practicality. Then, slowly, she wrapped her arms around him and let him take her weight. Lowell stood carefully, adjusting to the burden. She was solid and strong, heavier than a human woman of similar size would be, but well within his capabilities. "What is your name?" he asked as he prepared to leave the cave. "I've been calling you the orc woman in my head, but you deserve better." A pause. Then quietly, "Vekla." "Well, Vekla, my cabin has a real bed, a stove, and supplies that will last us through the winter. We will get you there and you will heal. After that, you can decide what you want to do, but for now, just hold on." The journey back to his cabin took 6 hours, 3 times longer than it should have in normal conditions. Lowell broke trail through virgin snow, searching for the landmarks he knew were hidden beneath the white blanket. Vekla's weight bore down on his shoulders and back, but he kept moving through sheer stubborn will. She remained conscious for the first hour, then slipped back into feverish sleep, her breathing hot against the side of his neck. He found the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks, its familiar outline rising from the snow like a promise kept. Smoke still rose from the chimney, meaning the fire he had banked before leaving had somehow survived, a small miracle that probably saved them both from freezing that night. The interior was blessedly warm compared to the outside. Lowell lowered Vekla onto his bed as gently as possible and immediately set about building up the fire and heating water. She needed broth and warmth and continued care for the wound, and now he had the resources to provide all of it. Over the next week, he fell into a routine built around her recovery. Each morning he would change her bandages and check for signs of infection. The wound was healing, slowly but steadily, and the fever had broken on the second day after they arrived. He made rich broths from dried meat and vegetables, coaxing her to eat even when she claimed she had no appetite. He kept the cabin warm and the water clean, and he gave her space to process everything that had happened. Vekla, for her part, watched him with wary confusion that gradually transformed into something else. She asked questions about his life in the mountains, about why he had left human civilization, about what he planned to do when winter ended. He answered honestly, finding it surprisingly easy to talk to her. "I was a soldier," he told her one evening as they shared a simple meal by the fire. "3rd Mountain Infantry, Border Defense. I followed orders for 8 years, did things I am not proud of, and watched good people die for bad reasons. When my term of service ended, I took my discharge pay and came here. Built this cabin with my own hands, learned to live off the land. I have not regretted it once. You not get lonely?" She asked. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but loneliness is better than being surrounded by people who expect you to be something you are not." She nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling." As the days passed, Vekla grew stronger. She could sit up without assistance, then stand, then walk around the cabin. The wound had closed cleanly, leaving a scar that would probably fade with time. Her color returned, that vibrant sage green that reminded Lowell of spring growth, and her amber eyes regained their fierce brightness. But with her physical recovery came a growing tension neither of them acknowledged directly. They were living in close quarters, sharing space in a way that necessitated a certain intimacy. He had seen her at her weakest, had tended to her body with clinical efficiency, but now she was awake and aware, and the nature of their situation had changed. Lowell found himself noticing things he had no business noticing. The way firelight caught in her dark hair, the strength in her hands as she helped prepare food, the rare moments when she smiled, which transformed her entire face into something radiant. He told himself it meant nothing, that he was simply unaccustomed to company, that proximity was playing tricks on his lonely heart. But he knew he was lying to himself. One afternoon, 3 weeks after they arrived at the cabin, Vekla asked him why he had really refused to leave her in the mountains. They were sitting on opposite sides of the table, repairing winter clothes. The work gave them something to do with their hands while they talked, a comfortable domesticity that had developed naturally. "I told you," Lowell said, concentrating on the seam he was stitching. "My conscience would not allow it." "That is true," Vekla said, "but it is not the whole truth. I have been thinking about this. You went far beyond what conscience demands. You risked your life in a blizzard to find me. You carried me for hours through deep snow. You have given me your bed and shared your supplies for weeks. Why?" He set down his work and looked at her directly. "Do you want the truth? I would prefer it to polite evasions." Lowell took a breath. "When I found you wounded and alone, I saw someone who had sacrificed everything for a principle. You chose to save a child even though you knew it would destroy your life. That kind of courage is rare, Vekla. It reminded me that there is still goodness in the world, and I could not stand by and watch it die in the snow." Her hands had stilled on the garment she was mending. "You barely knew me. I knew enough. The fact that you saved a human child tells me more about your character than 1,000 conversations could." He paused, then added more quietly, "And perhaps I was tired of being alone but too stubborn to admit it." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Finally, Vekla said, "I do not belong anywhere now. My clan has cast me out. Human settlements would kill me on sight. When I am fully healed, I have nowhere to go." "You could stay here," Lowell said, the words emerging before he could second-guess them. "If you wanted. There is room, and the work of surviving in the mountains is easier with 2 people than 1. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You would let an orc woman live in your cabin, share your supplies and your space. I would let you live here, Vekla. Not because you are an orc woman, but because you are someone worth knowing." Her eyes glistened suddenly, though no tears fell. "You are a strange man, Lowell Osborne, so I have been told." She returned to her mending, but something had shifted in the air between them. A door had been opened that neither could fully close again. The winter deepened around them, but inside the cabin, a different kind of warmth grew. They developed rhythms of work and rest that complemented each other. Lowell taught Vekla the patterns of hunting in the mountains, showing her how to read animal tracks and where the game was likely to shelter. She shared knowledge of her own, herbs and plants that could be used for medicine or food, skills passed down through generations of her people. They talked late into the evenings, sharing stories from their different lives. Vekla told him about growing up in an orc clan, the strict hierarchy and the constant pressure to prove strength and loyalty. She described the raid where she found the human child, a girl no more than 6 years old hiding in a root cellar while the fighting raged above. "She looked at me with such terror," Vekla said, staring into the fire. "I was everything she had been taught to fear. But she was just a child, and the others would have killed her without thought. I could not do it. I told her to stay silent, and when the raid ended, I reported that she had escaped into the woods." "But they discovered the truth," Lowell said. Vekla nodded. "Another warrior saw me leave the cellar. He said nothing during the raid, but when we returned to the clan, he reported what he saw. They called me a traitor. My own sister was the one who put the blade in my side." Lowell felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of her being attacked by her own blood, but he kept his voice steady. "That child is alive because of you. That matters. Does it? I wonder sometimes if I changed anything, or if I simply destroyed myself for nothing." He leaned forward. "You changed everything for that one child. She will grow up, Vekla. She will have a life she would not have had. That is not nothing." Vekla looked at him then with such naked emotion that it made his chest ache. "How do you see good in such a mess?" "Because you made an impossible choice and chose compassion. That is the definition of good. She reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact beyond what was necessary. Her palm was warm and calloused from work, her fingers strong. Lowell turned his hand to thread their fingers together, and neither of them pulled away. They sat like that until the fire burned low, hands joined, two people from different worlds who had somehow found each other in the wilderness. As winter's grip tightened, they were forced into even closer quarters. The cold outside became so severe that they abandoned any pretense of Lowell sleeping on the floor and instead shared the bed for warmth, lying back to back with layers of blankets piled over them. It was practical and necessary, and if Lowell found himself acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, he tried not to examine those feelings too closely. But awareness grew into something deeper whether he wanted it to or not. He began to notice the small things about her. The way she hummed tunelessly while working, how her face softened when she thought no one was watching, the fierce determination with which she approached every task, as if proving something to herself. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, human or otherwise, and he found himself wanting to know everything about her. Vecla seemed to be fighting her own battle. Lowell caught her watching him sometimes with an expression that held confusion and something that might be longing. She would look away quickly when their eyes met, but the moments accumulated, building a tension that neither of them addressed. The breaking point came during a particularly vicious storm in the deepest part of winter. The wind screamed around the cabin with such force that Lowell worried it might tear the roof free. Snow piled against the walls until they were nearly buried, and the cold crept in through every tiny gap, despite the roaring fire. They had been trapped inside for 3 days, and cabin fever was setting in. Vecla paced like a caged animal, her energy with nowhere to go. Lowell tried to give her space, but in the confined area, that was nearly impossible. Finally, she rounded on him with frustration blazing in her amber eyes. "I cannot do this," she said. "This waiting, this pretending, it is driving me mad." "What are you pretending?" he asked, though his heart had started beating faster because he thought he knew. "That I do not feel things I should not feel, that sharing your bed means nothing. That I have not been falling in love with you since the day you refused to leave me in that cave." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Lowell stood slowly. "Vecla." "No," she held up a hand. "Let me finish. I know this is impossible. I know your people would despise you for it, and mine already hate me. I know there is no future in this, but I am tired of lying to myself about what I want." "And what do you want?" She met his eyes with naked honesty. I want you. And I hate myself for it because I have no right to complicate your life this way." Lowell crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. He took her face in his hands, gentle despite the intensity of his emotions, and searched her eyes for any hint of doubt. He found none. "You are not complicating my life," he said. "You are the best thing that has happened to me in years. And I have been in love with you for weeks, but I was afraid to say it because I thought you could never want someone like me. Someone like you." She laughed, though it sounded dangerously close to a sob. "Lowell, you are the finest man I have ever known. Human or orc, it does not matter. You are good and kind and strong in ways that have nothing to do with muscle. How could I not love you?" He kissed her then, and she kissed him back with fierce intensity. It was not gentle or tentative, but rather a claiming on both sides, a declaration that all the practical reasons this should not happen were meaningless against what they felt. Her small tusks pressed against his lips, unfamiliar but not unwelcome, just another part of her that made her exactly who she was. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vekla rested her forehead against his. "This will not be easy," she whispered. "Nothing worth having ever is," Lowell replied. They made love that night with the storm raging outside and the fire burning low, learning the landscape of each other's bodies with reverent care. Vekla was strong and solid and gloriously alive beneath his hands, and Lowell worshipped every inch of her with devotion that made her gasp. She, in turn, traced the scars on his body from years of soldiering and kissed each one as if she could heal old wounds with tenderness. Afterward they lay tangled together beneath the blankets, her head on his chest and his arms around her. "What happens when spring comes?" Vekla asked quietly. "We decide together," Lowell said. "This is not just my life anymore, it is ours." She tilted her head to look at him. "You would truly want that, a life with me?" "I would want nothing more." Vekla kissed his jaw, then settled back against his chest. "Then we will build something new, something that is neither human nor orc but simply ours." Lowell held her tighter, thinking that she had put words to exactly what he hoped for. They would create their own place in the world, defined by their choices rather than the expectations of peoples who would never accept them anyway. The storm eventually passed, as all storms do. When they emerged from the cabin into the brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow, everything looked new and full of possibility. They set about the work of surviving together, and if their partnership held dimensions beyond the practical, that was their business and no one else's. As winter began its slow retreat, Lowell taught Vekla the skills she would need to truly thrive in the mountains. They worked together to lay in supplies for the coming year, smoking meat and preserving what they could. The physical labor was demanding, but they found joy in it, in the simple fact of building something together. One clear afternoon in early spring, when the snow had retreated enough to allow easier movement, they were checking the trap lines together when Vekla suddenly stopped walking. Lowell turned back to find her staring down the mountain toward the distant valley. "What is it?" he asked. "I was just thinking about the child," she said. "The one I saved. She would be older now. Maybe she is learning to read or helping her mother with chores, living a normal life." Lowell moved to stand beside her. "She is alive because you were brave. That will always matter." Vekla took his hand. "I paid a high price for that choice. My clan, my family, everything I knew. But standing here now, I cannot bring myself to regret it. If I had not been cast out, I would never have found you, and you are worth more to me than anything I lost." He raised her hand to his lips. "We found each other. That is the only truth that matters." They stood together on the mountainside, two people who should have been enemies but had instead chosen love. The world spread out below them, vast and indifferent to their small rebellion, but they had carved out a space that was entirely their own. As spring advanced, bringing with it the greening of the high meadows and the return of game to the forests, a new challenge emerged. Lowell had spotted smoke from the valley on several occasions, signs that human settlers were pushing further into the mountains. With them would come the danger that someone might stumble across the cabin and Vekla. He discussed it with her one evening as they planned the summer's work. "We should prepare for the possibility of visitors," Lowell said. "Hunters, trappers, maybe even prospectors looking for ore. If they find you here, there could be trouble." Vekla's expression was calm. "I will not hide what I am. I have done that before, and it only leads to more problems. If someone comes, they will see me for who I am. That could be dangerous for both of us. I know. But I will not cower anymore, Lowell. I would rather face whatever comes with my head held high." He admired her courage even as it concerned him. "Then we will face it together. But I will build a second shelter further up the mountain, a place you can retreat to if things turn violent. Not to hide, but to be safe." She agreed to that compromise, and Lowell spent the next week constructing a small but solid shelter in a hidden valley above the cabin. It had a cache of supplies and defensible positioning. He hoped they would never need it, but preparation had kept him alive through the war. The first test came in midsummer when two trappers appeared at the cabin looking for information about the area. Lowell met them outside, and their conversation was friendly enough until Vekla emerged from the cabin carrying an armload of firewood. The trappers went silent, hands dropping to weapons. Lowell stepped smoothly between them and Vekla, his own hands visible and empty but his body language making his position clear. "She is with me," he said calmly. "She means you no harm." The older of the two trappers, a grizzled man with gray shot through his beard, stared at Vekla with open hostility. "You are harboring a greenskin. Do you know what her kind has done to settlements in the valley?" "I know what individuals from her people have done, just as I know what individuals from our people have done to orc camps. Vekla is not responsible for the crimes of others any more than you or I are." "She is an abomination," the younger trapper spat. "She should be killed on sight." Lowell's voice went cold. "Then you will have to kill me first because I will not let you harm her." The tension stretched taut. The trappers were armed, but so was Lowell, and his positioning gave him advantage. More importantly, his eyes held the flat certainty of someone who had fought before and would do so again without hesitation. The older trapper finally shook his head. "You are a fool, but it is your funeral. Come on, boy, we are leaving." As they departed, the younger one looked back. "People will hear about this. You will not be welcome in the valley anymore." "I have not been to the valley in 5 years," Lowell said. "I will survive without their welcome." Once they were gone, Vekla came to stand beside him. "That will not be the last time." "No," he agreed. "But we handled it. We will handle the next one too." She leaned against his shoulder briefly. "Thank you for standing with me. Always." True to the younger trapper's word, they had more visitors over the following weeks. Some came out of curiosity, others with clear hostile intent. Lowell turned them all away with a combination of reason and implied threat. His reputation as a former soldier helped. Most men thought twice about starting trouble with someone who had survived the border wars, but the encounters took their toll. Vekla became more withdrawn, burdened by guilt that Lowell was being ostracized because of her. He tried to reassure her that he had chosen this isolation long before she arrived, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. The situation came to a head on a sweltering day in late summer when a group of 6 men arrived at the cabin with weapons drawn and anger in their voices. Lowell recognized one of them as the younger trapper from the first encounter, and he understood immediately that this was not a visit but an attack. "We warned you," the young trapper called. "We told you to get rid of the greenskin, but you would not listen. Now we are going to do it for you." Lowell emerged from the cabin with his rifle held ready. "The first man who takes another step will be the first to die. I fought in the border wars for 8 years. I can drop 3 of you before you reach the porch, and I will not hesitate if you force my hand." An older man in the group, someone Lowell did not recognize, spoke up. "Be reasonable, Osborne. We do not want to kill you, just give us the orc and we will leave you in peace." "There will be no peace if you harm her. There will only be blood. Now turn around and leave my land." "One man cannot hold against 6, another voice said. "Want to test that theory?" Lowell's finger rested on the trigger and his aim never wavered. Then Vekla stepped out onto the porch beside him, holding her own bow with an arrow nocked. "He is not one man. He is one man with excellent aim and a woman who has been hunting since before you could walk. We will give you one chance to leave. After that, we start shooting." Her presence seemed to enrage the young trapper. "You see, this is what they do." They corrupt good men, turn them against their own kind. We have to end this." But the older man who had spoken before put a hand on the young one's shoulder. "Look at them, boy. They are not backing down. We lose people if we press this, maybe all of us. And for what? To kill one orc who is living in the middle of nowhere bothering nobody. She is an abomination. And he is a free man on his own land. I did not come up here to die for someone else's hatred." The older man looked at Lowell. "We are leaving. But understand that you are choosing exile from human society. If you ever come down to the valley, you will not be welcome." "I understand," Lowell said, "and I accept those terms." The group left, though the young trapper did so with clear reluctance. When they were finally out of sight, Lowell lowered his rifle and let out a long breath. Vekla did the same with her bow. "That was close," she said quietly. "Too close." Lowell turned to her. "Are you all right?" "I am fine. But you just made yourself an outcast to defend me." "I made myself an outcast 5 years ago when I came to these mountains. Today I just made it official." He cupped her face in his hand. "I meant what I said, Vekla. I choose you over any alternative, always." She kissed him fiercely. "Then we are both outcasts together." "Sounds perfect to me." They spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin's defenses, but there were no more attacks. Word apparently spread that Lowell Osborne had turned hostile and was living with an orc woman, and most people decided that was a problem not worth solving. The few travelers who still passed through gave the cabin a wide berth. Lowell found he did not miss human company at all. He had everything he needed right here. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, they prepared for their second winter together. The work felt different now, laden with the weight of permanence. This was not a temporary arrangement, but a life they were building with conscious intent. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Vekla approached Lowell with unusual nervousness in her manner. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set aside the tool he had been sharpening. "What is it?" She sat across from him, hands folded in her lap. "In my clan, when two people decide to build a life together, there is a ritual. They mix blood and speak vows before the spirits of the mountain. It is considered binding, more permanent than your human marriages." Lowell's heart rate picked up. "Is that something you want with me?" "I want you to understand what it means first. If we do this, there is no going back. In the eyes of my people, we would be bound until death. Even though I am cast out, even though they would never recognize it, it would still mean that to me." He moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Vekla, I have been yours since the day I refused to leave you in that cave. If you want to formalize that with a ritual, with blood and vows, then I would be honored. But I need you to know that I already consider myself bound to you in every way that matters." Tears spilled down her cheeks, the first time he had seen her cry. "You are certain. You understand you would be binding yourself to an orc, to someone your people consider a monster. I would be binding myself to the woman I love. Everything else is just noise." They performed the ritual 3 days later, on the night of the first full moon after the snow came. Vekla had explained the process, and Lowell had agreed to every part of it. They climbed to a high place above the cabin, where the mountain's bones broke through the soil and the sky stretched endless overhead. Vekla brought a knife passed down through her family, one of the few possessions she had carried with her from the clan. They stood facing each other in the moonlight, and she spoke the words in her own language first, a flowing cadence that sounded like music. Then she translated for him. "I, Vekla of the Running Bear clan, bind my blood and my life to yours. I swear to stand with you against all challenges, to share your burdens and your joys, to honor you until my last breath leaves my body. Let the mountain spirits witness this oath." She drew the blade across her palm, then offered it to Lowell. He took it without hesitation. I, Lowell Osborne, bind my blood and my life to yours. I swear to stand with you against all challenges, to share your burdens and your joys, to honor you until my last breath leaves my body. Let the mountain spirits witness this oath." He drew the blade across his own palm, and they pressed their bleeding hands together, fingers interlacing. Vekla spoke more words in her language, and Lowell felt something shift in the air around them, as if the mountain itself was paying attention. Then she kissed him, and the world narrowed to just the two of them. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their old lives. They bound their hands with clean cloth and descended back to the cabin together. That night, they made love with a tenderness that felt sacred, two souls recognizing they were irrevocably joined. The second winter was easier than the first in many ways. They knew each other's rhythms now, worked together with practiced efficiency, and the small space of the cabin felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. But it was harder in other ways too, because they both understood now what they stood to lose if something went wrong. Lowell found himself thinking about the future more seriously. They could not live in complete isolation forever. Eventually, supplies would run low, equipment would need replacing, and circumstances might force them into contact with others. He began to consider possibilities. "What if we went further into the mountains?" he asked one night as they lay together. "Beyond the areas humans typically explore. There are valleys up there that no one has mapped, places where we could truly be alone." Vekla traced patterns on his chest. "You would leave this cabin you built, this life you created. I would leave anything if it meant keeping you safe and building a real future together." She was quiet for a long moment. "There are stories in my clan of orcs who fled even further than the mountains, beyond the great peaks, in the lands where snow never melts. They say some of them made lives there, away from the conflicts with humans. I always thought they were just stories. What if they are not? What if there is a place where we could exist without constantly watching our backs? It would be dangerous to find out. The crossing over the peaks is deadly." Lowell smiled in the darkness. "We have survived worse together." They spent the remainder of winter planning. Lowell drew maps from memory of military surveys he had seen, trying to piece together what might lie beyond the mountain range. Vekla contributed knowledge passed down through oral tradition in her clan. Together they assembled a picture of possibilities. When spring came again, they made their decision. They would spend the summer gathering supplies and preparing for a major expedition. When autumn arrived and the weather was stable but not yet deadly, they would attempt to cross the peaks and see what lay beyond. It was a gamble, but staying where they were meant eventual discovery and conflict. Better to seek a new life on their own terms than wait for old enemies to force their hands. The summer passed in intensive preparation. They dried meat until they had more than they could carry, packed medical supplies, gathered tools and weapons. Lowell built a sled that could be dragged over snow, designed to hold their most essential possessions. Vekla sewed new clothes designed for extreme cold, incorporating techniques from her people with materials scavenged from Lowell's old military gear. As the days grew shorter and the aspens turned gold, they made final preparations. Lowell took one last look around the cabin he had built with his own hands, the first real home he had known since childhood. There was sadness in leaving it, but also excitement for what might come next. They set out on a clear morning in early autumn. The sled dragged behind them, loaded with everything they would need to start over. The route Lowell had planned would take them along the high ridges, following animal trails where possible and cutting new paths where necessary. The first week was grueling but manageable. They made steady progress, camping each night in spots that offered shelter from the wind. The weather held, and their supplies remained intact. Lowell began to feel cautiously optimistic. Then, on the 8th day, they encountered something unexpected. They had crested a rise and were preparing to descend into a narrow valley when Vekla grabbed Lowell's arm. He followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Below them, scattered across the valley floor, were the remains of what looked like an abandoned camp. But it was not the structures that concerned him. It was the figures moving among them, orcs, at least a dozen of them. Vekla's grip on his arm tightened. "We need to go back, now." But it was too late. One of the orcs below had spotted them and was pointing upward. Others turned to look, and Lowell could see weapons being drawn even from this distance. "Run or stand?" he asked quietly. Vekla's face was pale beneath her green skin. "If we run, they will chase us and we will be caught in the open. If we stand, we might be able to talk our way out." "Will they listen?" "I do not know, but I recognize the banner. They are from the Iron Peak clan, rivals to my former people. They might not know who I am." They descended carefully, hands visible and away from weapons. The orc band formed a loose circle around them as they reached the valley floor. Up close, Lowell could see these were warriors, scarred and hardened by combat. The leader, a massive male with intricate tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward. He spoke in the orc language, harsh and guttural. Vekla responded in kind, her tone respectful but not submissive. A conversation followed that Lowell could not understand, though he watched the body language carefully. The other orcs seemed confused by their presence, but not immediately hostile. Finally, the leader switched to rough human speech. "She says you are bound mates, that you travel to the far land seeking a new home." "That is the truth," Lowell said carefully. "Why would a human bind himself to an orc? This makes no sense. Because I love her and she loves me. It is that simple." The leader studied him with eyes that missed nothing. "You are a warrior. I can see it in how you stand, how you watch for threats. You could have any human woman you wanted. Why choose this? Because she is worth more than any alternative. Because she saved a human child at the cost of everything she knew. Because when I needed someone, she was there. And because love does not follow logic." The leader looked between them, then said something in orc language that made Vekla stiffen. She responded sharply, and heated words were exchanged. Finally, she turned to Lowell. "He says he knows who I am. Word of my exile has spread to other clans. Some see me as a traitor, but others see me as someone who followed her own honor rather than blind loyalty. He is offering us safe passage through their territory and information about the lands beyond the peaks." Lowell felt hope kindle in his chest. "Why would he help us?" the leader grunted. "Because the world has enough hate without me adding to it, and because maybe there is wisdom in what you do. Humans and orcs have been killing each other for generations. What has it gained us? Perhaps trying something different is worth the attempt." He provided them with maps drawn on leather, showing passes through the mountains that were not on any human charts. He warned them about areas where avalanches were common and places where fresh water could be found. Most importantly, he told them about a valley 3 weeks' journey from their current location where a small mixed community supposedly existed. "I have not seen it myself," the leader admitted. "But traders speak of it. Orcs and humans and others who have all left their old lives behind. They call it Last Haven. Whether it truly exists or is just a story desperate people tell themselves, I cannot say." "Thank you," Vekla said in her own language. The leader nodded. "Walk with honor, both of you. And if you find this Last Haven, remember to be better than those who came before." They parted ways with unexpected goodwill. As Lowell and Vekla continued their journey, he felt something shift in his understanding of the world. The leader had been right. Generations of conflict had solved nothing. Maybe what he and Vekla were building together was not just personal but something larger, a small repudiation of old hatreds. The next 3 weeks tested them more severely than anything they had faced before. The passes were treacherous, requiring climbing skills Lowell had learned in the military and strength Vekla possessed naturally. They lost part of their supplies when the sled broke on a particularly steep descent, and spent 2 desperate days fashioning a new way to carry what remained. They endured a blizzard that trapped them in a shallow cave for 4 days, rationing food while the wind tried to claw them from their shelter. They navigated a glacier field where one wrong step meant falling into crevices that had no bottom. They survived an encounter with a mountain cat that saw them as potential prey, fighting it off together with coordinated precision that spoke to how well they knew each other. But they survived. And on a cold, clear morning, as the sun rose over the peaks behind them, they crested the final ridge and looked down into a valley unlike any Lowell had seen before. It was green, impossibly so given the elevation and the season. Hot springs must feed it, creating a microclimate that allowed vegetation to thrive. Smoke rose from scattered structures, and even from this distance, Lowell could see figures moving about. "Is that it?" Vekla whispered. "Is that Last Haven? Only one way to find out." They descended carefully, and as they drew closer, details resolved. The structures were a mix of architectural styles, some built in human fashion with log walls and pitched roofs, others in the orc style with stone and earth. People worked in fields where improbable crops grew. Children played in a central square, and those children were both human and orc. They were met at the edge of the settlement by a welcoming committee of 3. A human woman with gray in her hair, an orc male missing one tusk, and a third person whose heritage seemed to blend both races in ways Lowell had not thought possible. The human woman spoke first. "Welcome to Last Haven. I am Nira Rasmussen, one of the founders. You look like you have had a hard journey." 3 weeks over the peaks," Lowell said. "We were told this place might exist, but we did not dare hope." "It exists because people like you keep finding us," the orc male said. His voice was rough but not unfriendly. "People who do not fit in the old world. We are not perfect here, but we try to be better. What are your names?" "Lowell Osborne. This is Vekla, my mate." Nira's eyes crinkled with a smile. "Bound mates. That is rare and precious. Come, you must be exhausted. We will get you settled, and you can tell us your story." They were given a small cabin on the edge of the settlement, simple but sturdy. Over the following days, they learned the history of Last Haven. It had been founded 10 years ago by a group of humans and orcs who had met during a temporary truce in the border conflicts. They had discovered that away from the pressures of their respective societies, they actually liked each other. When the war resumed, they fled together into the mountains and eventually found this valley. Others had trickled in over the years. Some were like Lowell and Vekla, couples who defied convention to be together. Others were individuals who simply could not stomach the hatred anymore. The population was small, maybe 50 people total, but they had built something functional and, more importantly, peaceful. Lowell and Vekla integrated quickly. His skills as a hunter and his knowledge of wilderness survival made him valuable. Vekla's understanding of orc herbal medicine filled a gap in the community's capabilities. But beyond practical contributions, they found something they had not realized they were seeking: acceptance. For the first time since their lives intersected, no one looked at them with suspicion or hostility. Their relationship was simply one of many in the settlement, neither remarkable nor condemned. They could walk hand in hand through the central square without drawing stares. They could simply exist without constantly watching their backs. It was transformative. As their first winter in Last Haven approached, Lowell and Vecla worked with others to prepare the community for the harsh months ahead. The hot springs that fed the valley provided some protection from the worst cold, but supplies still needed to be laid in and shelters reinforced. One evening, as they worked together to repair the roof of their cabin, Vecla paused to look out over the valley. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Everything you gave up to be with me." Lowell set down his hammer and moved to stand beside her. "Not once. Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Vecla. This life we have built together, this place we found, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." She leaned against him. "I keep thinking about that child I saved. She would be older now, maybe 8 or 9. I wonder if she is happy, if she even remembers what happened." "I think she remembers," Lowell said. "And when she is older, she will understand what you sacrificed for her. Maybe she will be the kind of person who makes different choices because of it. Maybe she will help build bridges instead of walls." "That is a nice thought." "It is more than a thought. It is how change happens, one person at a time choosing to be better." Vecla turned in his arms to face him fully. "We should have children." The statement was so unexpected that Lowell needed a moment to process it. "Is that even possible? Between our peoples?" "The evidence walks around this settlement every day," she said, gesturing toward where several of the mixed heritage children were playing. "It is rare, but it happens. And I find myself wanting that with you. A family that is ours, built on love rather than obligation." Lowell felt emotion well up in his chest. "I would want that too, more than I can put into words." They stood together on their half-repaired roof as the sun set over the valley, two people who had found impossible love in a world that tried to keep them apart. They had crossed mountains and survived storms, faced down enemies and exile, all for the chance to build something true. And now they were home. The winter passed in the warmth of community and the growing closeness between Lowell and Vecla. They spent evenings with other settlers, sharing stories and building friendships. They learned from the mixed heritage families about the challenges and joys of raising children who belonged to both worlds. They made plans for the future, imagining the garden they would plant in spring and the improvements they would make to their cabin. When the snows finally began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the fields, Vecla confirmed what they had both begun to suspect. She was pregnant. The news was met with celebration throughout Last Haven. Children were precious in the small community, each one representing hope for the future. Nira, who had training as a midwife, took Vecla under her wing, preparing her for what was to come. Lowell found himself oscillating between joy and terror. The pregnancy would be difficult, Nira warned. Mixed heritage children often came with complications, but Vecla was strong and healthy, and they had months to prepare. As summer arrived, bringing with it the full bloom of the valley's gardens, Vecla's pregnancy became obvious. She carried the child with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, refusing to let it slow her down more than absolutely necessary. Lowell hovered, probably more than was helpful, but she tolerated his worry with patient affection. They spent long evenings talking about the future, about what they would teach their child, and how they would raise someone to be proud of both heritages. They chose names for both possibilities, though they would not know until birth whether they would have a son or daughter. In the early autumn, as the leaves began to turn and the air took on a crisp edge, Vecla went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following day. Lowell stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and offering what comfort he could. When their daughter finally arrived, squalling and perfect, Lowell wept openly. She had Vecla's green skin, though a lighter shade, and his brown eyes. She was small and wrinkled and absolutely beautiful. "What should we name her?" Vecla asked, exhausted but radiant. They had discussed this. If a girl, they would use a name from Vecla's people. If a boy, one from Lowell's. He looked at his daughter, this perfect blend of both their worlds, and spoke the name they had chosen. Saria. Vecla smiled. Saria, it is perfect. The first years of Saria's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. She grew quickly, showing characteristics of both her parents. She had Lowell's stubbornness and Vecla's fierce spirit. She learned to speak both human common tongue and the orc language, slipping between them with ease. Lowell marveled at how normal this life felt, how completely he had settled into being a husband and father in a community of outcasts and dreamers. There were challenges, of course. Resources were sometimes scarce, and winters could be brutal even with the protection of the hot springs. But they faced everything together, the entire community supporting each other through difficult times. When Saria was 3 years old, another group of refugees arrived in Last Haven. Among them was a human woman with a child, fleeing an abusive situation in a lowland settlement. As the community welcomed them and helped them settle, Vecla took Lowell aside. "You see," she said quietly, "this is what we have built, a place where people can escape from the cruelty of the old world and find something better. That child I saved all those years ago, I wonder if she will grow up to create places like this or find refuge in them." "She will," Lowell said with certainty, "because you showed her that there was another way, that even in the midst of violence, compassion is possible." They watched Saria playing with the other children, a living symbol of what could be achieved when people chose love over hate. She was not the only mixed heritage child in Last Haven anymore. Others had followed, and the next generation was growing up without the prejudices that had defined their parents' lives. As the years continued to pass, Last Haven grew slowly but steadily. Word spread through careful channels about the valley where refugees could find acceptance. The community implemented careful screening to ensure new arrivals were genuinely seeking peace rather than bringing old conflicts with them. But they turned few away. Lowell took on a leadership role, helping to organize the community's defenses and plan for expansion. Vecla became the settlement's primary healer, combining orc herbal knowledge with human medical techniques to create something more effective than either alone. Together they were respected elders of the community, their relationship a model for others to aspire to. Saria grew into a bright, confident young woman who moved between both cultures with ease. She had friends among both human and orc children, and she seemed to genuinely not understand the prejudices that existed outside the valley. To her, people were simply people. On a warm summer evening when Saria was 16, the family sat together outside their cabin watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. She was telling them about her plans to train as a teacher, to help educate the younger children. "Someone has to make sure the next generation learns better than the ones before," she said with the passionate certainty of youth. "We can build a world where humans and orcs work together instead of fighting. Last Haven proves it is possible." Lowell and Vecla exchanged glances, the wordless communication of two people who had spent decades together. Then Lowell spoke. "When I first found your mother injured in the mountains, I never imagined all of this. I just knew I could not leave her to die. That one choice led to everything we have now. It taught me that the smallest acts of compassion can have consequences far beyond what we can imagine." Vecla took his hand. "And I learned that not all humans are the enemy, that love is stronger than the hatreds we are taught to carry. We have built something good here, not just for ourselves but for everyone who comes after. Saria smiled at them both. You two are disgustingly romantic, you know that, guilty as charged, Lowell said, pulling Vekla closer. They sat together as the stars began to emerge, 3 generations of a family that should never have existed, living proof that a better world was possible. The path from that desperate winter day when Lowell refused to turn back without Vekla to this peaceful evening had been long and difficult, but every hardship had been worth it, because they had found not just survival but life, not just coexistence but love, not just escape from the old world, but the courage to build a new one. And as the night deepened around them and the lights of Last Haven glowed warm and welcoming across the valley, Lowell reflected that he was exactly where he was meant to be. With the woman he loved, the daughter they had created together, and the community they had helped build, it was more than enough. It was everything. Years continued their steady march, bringing changes both large and small. Last Haven's population grew to over 200, requiring careful management of resources and expansion of housing. Lowell's hair turned gray, then white, and his movements slowed with the weight of age. Vekla remained strong longer, orc physiology granting her extended vitality, but even she began to show the passage of time. Saria had indeed become a teacher, and a good one. She married a young man of mixed heritage like herself, and they gave Lowell and Vekla grandchildren who played in the same valley where their parents had found refuge decades before. The cycle continued, each generation building on the foundation laid by those who came before. On a crisp autumn morning, when Lowell was in his 70s and Vekla not far behind in equivalent age, they took a walk together through the settlement. It had become their habit, a daily ritual of connection and remembrance. They passed the school where Saria taught, heard the laughter of children learning without prejudice. They visited the healing house where Vekla's techniques were now taught to a new generation of practitioners. They walked through fields where human and orc farmers worked side by side, producing food to sustain the community. Finally, they climbed to a small rise at the edge of the valley, a spot they had claimed years ago as their special place. From here, they could see the entirety of Last Haven spread below them, a patchwork of homes and gardens and lives intertwined. You remember that first winter in my cabin? Lowell asked, lowering himself carefully to sit on the grass. When we were just trying to survive, and everything seemed impossible. Vekla settled beside him with a soft grunt. Her joints ached more now, and the cold bothered her in ways it never had when she was young. I remember being certain I would die, and then being confused about why you would not let that happen. Best decision I ever made, Lowell said, refusing to turn back without you. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture as familiar now as breathing. We have had a good life, you and I. The best life. No regrets. Not one. Though I do wonder sometimes about that child I saved. She would be a woman grown now, maybe with children of her own. I hope she found happiness. I hope she found a life worth the sacrifice you made, Lowell said. But even if she did not, even if we never know what became of her, you gave her a chance. That matters. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the smoke rise from chimneys and people go about their daily business. Last Haven had become something neither of them could have imagined in those desperate early days. It was not perfect, but it was good. It was proof that another way was possible. When I am gone, Vekla said quietly, I want you to know that these years with you were worth everything I lost. My clan, my family, my place in the world. I would trade it all again for one more day with you. Lowell's throat tightened. You are not going anywhere without me, understand? We made vows on that mountain, bound in blood and spirit. Where you go, I follow. She lifted her head to look at him, amber eyes still bright despite the age in her face. Always so dramatic. You love it. I love you. They kissed, gentle and sweet. Two people who had spent a lifetime learning every detail of each other and still found wonder in the simple fact of their togetherness. The sun was setting when they finally made their way back down to their cabin. Saria had left food for them, knowing they often forgot to eat on their walking days. Their grandchildren would visit tomorrow, filling the house with noise and energy. But tonight was just for them, as so many nights had been over the decades. They ate together, talked about small things and large, and eventually climbed into the bed they had shared for most of their lives. Lowell pulled Vekla close, fitting their bodies together with the ease of long practice. She sighed contentedly, and he felt her breathing slow toward sleep. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what? For letting me find you, for loving me back, for building this life with me, for everything." Vekla's hand found his in the darkness, fingers interlacing. "The honor was mine, Lowell Osborne, every step of the way." They fell asleep like that, together as they had been through storms and sunshine, hardship and joy, exile and homecoming. Two people from different worlds who had refused to let those differences define them, who had instead chosen to build something new. The tracks in the snow had vanished into deep drifts all those years ago, but the mountain man had refused to turn back without her. That single act of stubborn compassion had led to this: a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy that would outlast them both. In the valley below, the lights of Last Haven glowed warm against the darkness, a beacon of hope for all who came seeking refuge. And in their small cabin, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds rested in the peace they had created together. It was, in every way that mattered, a happy ending. Not because everything was perfect, but because they had chosen each other every single day, through every challenge, until choosing became as natural as breathing. And that choice, renewed again and again across the years, had made all the difference.